Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Performance. The Ashford Estates grand ballroom sparkled under crystal chandeliers as guests filled the ornate space. Gideon Hale adjusted his charcoal gray suit and surveyed the scene with the calculating eyes of a former Army intelligence officer. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. His daughter, Ivy, looked radiant in her flowing white gown, dancing with her new husband, Riley Patterson, a decent young man from a good family. The 23-year-old had inherited her mother's striking features, but thankfully possessed her father's sharp intellect. Gideon had spent considerable effort ensuring this wedding would be perfect, though not for the reasons most fathers would. "Dad, the photographer wants family shots." 17-year-old Finn appeared at his elbow, his sandy hair still somehow disheveled despite multiple attempts to tame it for the occasion. "In a moment," Gideon replied, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd until they found their target. There she was, Celeste, his wife of 25 years, resplendent in midnight blue silk, playing the role of devoted mother and wife to perfection. She was currently speaking with the Patterson family, her melodious laugh carrying across the room as she charmed them with stories about Ivy's childhood. What the guests didn't know was that Mrs. Celeste Hale had been carrying on an affair for 8 months with Brock Valdez, Gideon's former business partner and supposed best friend. What Celeste didn't know was that Gideon had discovered their betrayal 3 months ago and had been orchestrating this elaborate trap ever since. The Ashford estate wasn't just a picturesque venue. Gideon had purchased it outright 6 weeks ago through a shell company. Every vendor, every staff member, every security detail was now under his control. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was the stage for the most carefully planned operation of his civilian life. "Mr. Hale?" The photographer, a nervous young man named Wesley, approached with his camera. "For the family portraits?" "Of course." Gideon smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Celeste, darling, time for pictures." As his wife glided over, Gideon noticed Brock lingering near the bar, his tall frame and silver-touched temples making him easily identifiable among the guests. The 48-year-old architect had been invited as a family friend, naturally. After all, who would suspect the man who'd stood as best man at their own wedding would be sleeping with the bride? The photographer positioned them on the marble steps leading to the garden terrace. Ivy and Riley in the center, flanked by both sets of parents, with Finn standing slightly apart, a detail Gideon had specifically requested. "Beautiful family," Wesley murmured, adjusting his lens. "You must be so proud." "Indeed," Gideon replied, his arm around Celeste's waist. She felt tense beneath his touch, probably worried about maintaining appearances. If only she knew how unnecessary her performance had become. As the photographer's flash illuminated their faces, Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from his security coordinator. Phase 1 complete. All systems operational. The real show was about to begin. After the photos, guests began filtering toward the dining room for the reception dinner. Gideon had spared no expense. A 7-course meal prepared by a renowned chef, wine from his private collection, entertainment that would keep everyone engaged and, more importantly, present for what was to come. "This is incredible, Dad," Ivy whispered, squeezing his arm as they walked. "Thank you for making this so special." Gideon's heart clenched. His daughter was innocent in all this, and he'd worked tirelessly to ensure her happiness wouldn't be collateral damage in his war against betrayal. "You deserve nothing less, sweetheart." As the evening progressed, Gideon played his part flawlessly, the proud father, the generous host, the devoted husband. He gave a heartfelt speech about family, love, and the importance of trust that had half the room in tears. Celeste watched him with something resembling guilt flickering in her green eyes, while Brock shifted uncomfortably at his table. They had no idea that every word, every gesture, every moment was being recorded by professionally hidden cameras throughout the venue. The audio equipment was military-grade, capable of picking up whispered conversations from across the room. Everything would be captured in pristine detail. "Dad, We have to leave. Now. Finn's urgent whisper cut through Gideon's satisfaction. His son had appeared beside him during the dessert course, his face pale and tight with concern. What's wrong? Gideon kept his voice level, though internally his mind raced through potential complications. I'll explain in the car. Something in Finn's tone, a mixture of fear and determination that reminded Gideon of his own younger self, made him reassess. His son wasn't given to dramatics or panic. If Finn said they needed to leave, there was a reason. Gideon made his excuses quietly, claiming a sudden headache, and followed Finn toward the exit. As they walked past the head table, he caught Celeste's questioning look and offered a reassuring smile. Just getting some air with Finn. Back a moment. The drive home was conducted in tense silence. Finn's hands clenched in his lap as he stared out the window of Gideon's black Mercedes. The family estate was only 15 minutes from the venue, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, as they pulled into the circular driveway of their Georgian mansion, Finn turned to face his father. You really didn't notice? His voice cracked slightly. Notice what? Finn took a shaky breath. The real purpose of that wedding wasn't celebrating Ivy's marriage, was it? It was your trap for Mom and Brock. And tonight, he paused, struggling with the words. Tonight, you were going to destroy them in front of everyone. Gideon's blood ran cold. How had his 17-year-old son pieced together his carefully guarded plan? But that's not the worst part, Dad. Finn's eyes, so much like his own, held a pain that made Gideon's chest tighten. I think they know. And they've been planning something too. Chapter 2. The Architect of Betrayal. 3 months earlier, Gideon Hale had been a man content with his carefully constructed life. His security consulting firm, built on the foundation of his military intelligence background, had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. His marriage to Celeste, though not passionate, had seemed stable. His children were thriving. Ivy engaged to a good man, Finn excelling in his senior year of high school. Then came a night that changed everything. Gideon had returned early from a business trip to Chicago, eager to surprise Celeste for their anniversary. The house had been dark except for a soft glow from their bedroom window. He'd climbed the stairs quietly, planning to slip into bed beside his wife, when he heard voices. Not just Celeste's voice. Brock's. Through the crack in the door, Gideon had watched his wife of 25 years and his closest friend of 30 years locked in an embrace that spoke of months, not moments, of intimacy. Their conversation afterward had been even more damning. Discussions of a future together, of dealing with Gideon, of liquidating assets, and starting fresh somewhere far away. But it was Brock's final comment that had sealed both their fates. Don't worry, darling. I've been documenting his business dealings for months. When the time comes, we'll have enough to destroy him financially and legally. He'll be too busy fighting criminal charges to come after us. Gideon had retreated to his study that night, his mind switching into the tactical mode that had made him legendary in Army intelligence. By morning, he had the framework of a plan that would make their betrayal seem like child's play compared to his response. The beauty of Gideon's approach lay in its patience and precision. Instead of confronting them immediately, he begun his own careful documentation. Private investigators, financial audits, background checks. He'd used every resource at his disposal to build an unassailable case against them both. What he discovered had exceeded even his worst expectations. Brock hadn't just been stealing architectural plans and client lists from their shared projects. He'd been systematically undermining Gideon's business relationships, spreading carefully crafted rumors about Gideon's reliability and ethics. 3 major contracts had been lost in the past year due to Brock's sabotage, each one redirected to Brock's own newly established firm. Celeste, meanwhile, had been far from the passive accomplice Gideon had initially assumed. Her family's old money connections and social influence had been weaponized against him. She'd been poisoning relationships within their social circle, setting the stage for Gideon's eventual downfall while positioning herself as the wronged wife of an increasingly unstable and aggressive husband. They'd been planning to frame him for corporate espionage, using forged documents that Brock had been crafting for months. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Celeste would file for divorce, citing mental cruelty and financial impropriety, while Brock would provide the evidence of Gideon's supposed crimes to federal investigators. But they'd underestimated their target. Gideon's military background wasn't just in intelligence. He'd been a strategic operations officer specializing in psychological warfare. He understood better than most that the most devastating defeats came not from brute force, but from turning an enemy's own momentum against them, which brought him to Ivy's wedding. The event had been planned long before Gideon discovered the affair, but it provided the perfect opportunity for his counterattack. Every detail had been repurposed to serve as larger strategy. The guest list hadn't just been about celebrating Ivy's marriage. It included every person whose opinion mattered in their professional and social circles. The venue's security system wasn't just for protection, it was for documentation. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment of the evening would be recorded and preserved. When the trap was sprung, there would be no possibility of denial or misdirection. The timing wasn't coincidental either. Brock and Celeste had planned to make their move immediately after the wedding, using the emotional stress of Ivy's departure from home as cover for their accusations about Gideon's mental state. They'd calculated that his attachment to his daughter would make him vulnerable and irrational. They were right about his attachment to Ivy. They were catastrophically wrong about how that attachment would manifest. Now, sitting in his study at 2 a.m. after fleeing the wedding reception, Gideon tried to process Finn's revelation. His son sat across from him, having changed out his formal, wearing jeans and a hoodie, looking far older than his 17 years. "How long have you known?" Gideon asked quietly. "About Mom and Brock?" "Since last Christmas," Finn replied, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "I came home early from Jake's house and saw them together in the kitchen. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then I started paying attention. And my plans?" Finn's smile was grim and disturbingly familiar. "Dad, you taught me to observe, remember? When you bought the Ashford estate through Meridian Holdings LLC, when you hired 3 times the normal security staff, when you started asking me detailed questions about photography angles and sound acoustics." He shrugged. "It wasn't hard to figure out you were planning something big." Gideon felt a mixture of pride and concern. His youngest child had inherited more than just his analytical mind. He'd inherited his capacity for strategic thinking. "So what did you see tonight that made us leave?" Finn pulled out his phone and showed Gideon a series of text messages. "I've been monitoring Mom's communications for weeks. Look at the timestamps." The messages were between Celeste and someone listed as legal. The conversation, beginning just hours before the wedding, detailed an emergency injunction that had been prepared, along with federal warrants based on the fabricated evidence Brock had compiled. They weren't planning to wait until after the wedding, Finn explained. They were going to have you arrested tonight at Ivy's reception in front of everyone. Maximum humiliation and chaos. Gideon's blood turned to ice. The timing would have been perfect from their perspective. His attempted revenge broadcast live as evidence of his unhinged mental state, while federal agents hauled him away in handcuffs before a room full of witnesses. "But here's the thing, Dad," Finn continued, his eyes hardening. "I may have inherited your tactical mind, but I also learned something else from you. When someone betrays your family, you don't just defeat them. You make sure they can never threaten anyone you love ever again." "Finn, no, listen. While you've been planning your elaborate psychological warfare, I've been working on something more direct." Finn's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Remember how you always said the best defense is turning your enemy's weapons against them?" Gideon nodded slowly. "Well, all those forged documents Brock created to frame you, I've had copies for months. And all those business relationships Mom poisoned, I've been documenting every lie, every manipulation, every piece of their conspiracy." Finn leaned forward. "But more importantly, I know something they don't, which is Brock's been stealing more than just your business secrets. He's been embezzling from his own clients, using the same shell companies he set up to frame you. And Mom's been helping him launder the money through her family's charitable foundation." The pieces clicked into place in Gideon's mind. "You have proof. Dad, I have enough proof to put them both away for decades. The question is, Do you want to just humiliate them, or do you want to destroy them completely? For the first time since discovering the affair, Gideon smiled with genuine pleasure. His son wasn't just brilliant, he was ruthless. The apple hadn't fallen far from the tree. Tell me everything. Chapter 3. The Son's Gambit. As dawn broke over the Hale estate, father and son sat surrounded by the evidence of the most comprehensive counterintelligence operation either had ever witnessed. Finn's laptop displayed multiple windows, financial records, communication logs, photographic evidence, and a complex timeline that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Jesus, Finn, Gideon breathed, scrolling through bank statements that showed a pattern of fund transfers spanning 2 years. How did you get access to Brock's private accounts? His son's expression was carefully neutral. Remember when you sent me to that cybersecurity camp last summer? Turns out I have a talent for digital archaeology. You hacked him. I prefer conducted unauthorized penetration testing of inadequately secured systems. Finn replied with a straight face that reminded Gideon painfully of his own younger self. The man uses his daughter's birthday as his password for everything. It was practically begging to be discovered. Gideon studied his son with new eyes. At 17, Finn had somehow managed to uncover a criminal conspiracy that had eluded Gideon's professional investigators. More importantly, he'd done it while maintaining the appearance of a typical teenager going about his normal life. The foundation money, Gideon said, pulling up another document. How much are we talking about? The Whitmore Foundation has been Mom's family's pet project for 3 generations, Finn explained. Cancer research, children's hospitals, scholarship programs, all legitimate on the surface. But look at the expenditure reports from the last 18 months. Gideon scanned the figures, his trained eye immediately spotting the irregularities. Consulting fees. To companies that don't exist. Brock Shells. He invoices the foundation for architectural services that were never rendered. The foundation pays the invoices, and the money gets cycled through 3 different holding companies before landing in an account in the Cayman Islands. Finn pulled up another screen. But here's where it gets interesting. The next document made Gideon's blood pressure spike. It was a property deed for a beachfront villa in Costa Rica, purchased 6 months ago under the name of one of Brock's shell companies. They've been planning this escape route for longer than I thought, Gideon murmured. It gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. Finn clicked through to a series of emails. Mom's been moving money out of your joint accounts in small increments, always staying just below the amounts that would trigger automatic reporting. She's been claiming it's for wedding expenses and household items. How much? For $100,000 so far. All of it sitting in an account that only she can access, waiting to be transferred to their Costa Rica nest egg. Gideon leaned back in his chair, processing the full scope of their betrayal. It wasn't just infidelity or even simple theft. It was a sophisticated, long-term operation designed to systematically destroy his life while funding theirs. There's more, Finn said quietly. And this is the part that really pisses me off. He pulled up a series of documents from the Foundation's files, grant applications, and recipient lists. The Children's Cancer Ward at St. Mary's Hospital. The one where they held that big fundraiser last year. The one Mom gave that speech about children deserving hope and fighting for their futures. Gideon remembered. Celeste had been genuinely moved that night, or so he'd thought. She'd spoken eloquently about protecting the innocent and ensuring that children had the resources they needed to survive and thrive. The grant was approved for $2 million, Finn continued, his voice tight with anger. But only $600,000 actually made it to the hospital. The rest was diverted through Brock's shells. Son of a bitch, Gideon whispered. Stealing from him was one thing. Stealing from dying children was another entirely. The scholarship program for underprivileged kids? Same thing. The domestic violence shelter that Mom chairs the board for? Same thing. Finn's hands were shaking slightly as he clicked through document after document. They've been stealing from cancer patients, abused women, and kids who just want a chance at college. Also, they could fund their little love nest in paradise. The tactical part of Gideon's mind was already working through the implications. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was criminal on a scale that would destroy them both completely. The evidence Finn had compiled wouldn't just ruin their reputations or cost them their freedom. It would obliterate any possibility of sympathy from friends, family, or the public. How did you know to look into the foundation? Gideon asked. Finn's expression darkened. Because 3 months ago, Mom asked me to write a college application essay about making a difference in the world. She suggested I write about the foundation's work and how it inspired me to want to help others. The irony was sickeningly perfect. Celeste had wanted their son to use her theft from charity as the basis for his college applications, essentially making Finn an unknowing accomplice in her crimes. I started researching the foundation's actual impact for the essay, Finn continued. When the numbers didn't add up, I dug deeper. That's when I found the discrepancies, which led me to the shell companies, which led me to Brock. And you've been sitting on this for months? I needed to be sure, and I needed to understand the full scope before doing anything irreversible. Finn met his father's eyes. I also needed to figure out whether you were planning to just get even or if you were planning to make sure they could never hurt anyone again. Gideon considered the question carefully. His original plan had been focused on public humiliation and financial damage, a psychological victory that would satisfy his need for revenge while keeping his own hands relatively clean. But the evidence of their theft from charity changed the equation entirely. They stole from dying children, Finn. Yeah, they did. And they were planning to have me arrested at Ivy's wedding. In front of 300 guests, including every business and social contact that matters to our family. Gideon's jaw tightened. The scope of their betrayal went beyond anything he'd imagined. This wasn't just about replacing him with Brock. It was about completely destroying his life, his reputation, and his relationship with his children while simultaneously stealing from the most vulnerable people in society. What's your recommendation? Finn pulled up one final document. A comprehensive plan that would have impressed Gideon's old commanding officers at the Pentagon. We give them exactly what they've been working toward, Finn said calmly. We let them think they've won. We let them make their move, arrest you, humiliate you publicly, and take everything you've built. That sounds like surrender, not victory. It sounds like setting the perfect trap. Finn's smile was predatory, because while they're celebrating their triumph, the FBI will be receiving a comprehensive package detailing their theft from federal tax-exempt charities. The IRS will be getting documentation of tax evasion and money laundering. And the media will be getting the complete story of how a prominent socialite and respected architect systematically stole millions from cancer patients and abused women. Gideon began to see the elegance of his son's approach. Public perception. Exactly. If we strike first, we look vindictive and potentially unstable. Exactly what they're trying to portray. But if we let them destroy you first, and then the evidence comes out. Finn shrugged. Suddenly, you're not a bitter husband getting revenge. You're the victim of a massive criminal conspiracy who is being framed to cover up theft from dying children. The timing would have to be perfect. I've already worked that out. The federal agencies get their packages Monday morning, 48 hours after your arrest. The media gets theirs Tuesday, once the agencies have had time to verify the initial evidence. By Wednesday, Mom and Brock go from being the victims of your unhinged revenge plot to being the subjects of a federal criminal investigation. Gideon studied the timeline his son had prepared. It was sophisticated, thorough, and utterly ruthless. More importantly, it would work. There's one problem, Gideon said slowly. If they arrest me tonight, I won't be in a position to protect you or Ivy from the fallout. Dad, Finn said quietly, I'm not planning to need protection. I'm planning to be the one who brings them down. Something in his son's tone made Gideon look up sharply. Finn's expression held a cold determination that was both impressive and deeply concerning. What aren't you telling me? Finn hesitated for the first time since they'd begun their conversation. There's something else. Something that changes everything. He pulled up a final folder on his laptop. One labeled simply insurance. What is it? Proof that they weren't planning to just frame you and disappear, Finn said quietly. They were planning to make sure you could never come after them. Ever. The documents that appeared on screen made Gideon's blood run cold. Medical records, insurance policies, and a series of communications with what appeared to be a private medical facility in Switzerland. They were going to have you declared mentally incompetent, Finn explained, his voice tight with anger. The criminal charges were just the first step. Once you were arrested and your mental breakdown was established, Mom was going to have you committed to a private psychiatric facility where Brock has connections. Indefinitely. The full scope of their plan hit Gideon like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to steal his money and disappear. They were planning to steal his life, his freedom, and his sanity. He would have been trapped in a foreign psychiatric facility while they lived off stolen charity money, probably for the rest of his life. That changes things, Gideon said quietly. Yeah, it does. Because attempted kidnapping and conspiracy to commit fraud against a federal tax-exempt organization aren't just civil matters. They're federal crimes with no statute of limitations. Finn closed the laptop and looked at his father directly. So I'll ask you again, Dad. Do you want to just humiliate them? Or do you want to make sure they never threaten anyone you love ever again? Gideon's answer was immediate and absolute. I want them destroyed. Good, Finn said, standing up. Because I've already put the first phase into motion. In about 6 hours, Mom and Brock are going to walk into the biggest trap of their lives. Chapter 4, The Trap Springs. By 9 a.m. Sunday morning, the Hale household appeared to have returned to normal post-wedding tranquility. Gideon sat in his study, ostensibly reviewing quarterly reports while actually monitoring the surveillance feeds Finn had established throughout the house. Celeste moved through her morning routine with the practiced grace of someone who had no idea her entire world was about to collapse. Coffee, darling, she asked, appearing in his doorway with a porcelain cup and her most winning smile. You seemed so stressed last night when you and Finn left early. I hope everything's all right. Just a migraine, Gideon replied, accepting the coffee without looking up from his laptop. You know how I get when there's too much noise and stimulation. It was a perfect setup line, and Celeste took it exactly as Finn had predicted she would. You have been under a lot of pressure lately, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. The Miller contract falling through, the issues with the Patterson project timeline. Sometimes I worry that you're pushing yourself too hard. Each word was carefully chosen, Gideon realized. She was laying the groundwork for the mental instability narrative that would justify his upcoming arrest and commitment. Every expression of concern was actually evidence being planted for future use. Perhaps you should consider taking some time off, Celeste continued. Maybe see Dr. Carrington again? You always said he helped you work through your stress after you left the military. Dr. Carrington, Gideon knew from Finn's research, was now affiliated with the Swiss facility where they planned to have him committed. Another piece of their long-term strategy. I'll consider it, he said mildly. Right now, I just want to focus on making sure Ivy and Riley are settled in their new place. Of course, you're such a devoted father. Celeste's smile was warm and seemingly genuine. That's one of the things I've always loved about you. The sheer audacity of her performance was almost admirable. In less than 12 hours, she was planning to have him arrested and imprisoned, yet she could sit there speaking of love with perfect sincerity. Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from Finn. Be arriving in 30. Phase 1 ready. I should let you get back to work, Celeste said, rising gracefully. Brock is coming by to discuss the Patterson project revisions. I hope you don't mind. I invited him to stay for lunch since he helped so much with the wedding preparations. Of course not, Gideon replied. He's always welcome here. As she left, Gideon opened the secure application Finn had installed on his phone. Multiple camera feeds showed different angles of the house, all recording in high definition with military-grade audio. Whatever happened in the next few hours would be documented with courtroom-quality precision. Brock arrived precisely on schedule, his silver Mercedes pulling into the circular driveway with the confidence of a man who believed victory was assured. He wore casual weekend attire, khakis and a polo shirt, but Gideon noticed the expensive briefcase and the slight tension in his shoulders. The man was preparing for war, not a friendly business discussion. Through the surveillance feed, Gideon watched Celeste greet Brock in the foyer with what appeared to be a casual hug between old friends. But the embrace lasted a fraction too long, and their whispered conversation was picked up clearly by the audio equipment. Is everything ready? Celeste asked. The warrants are signed, Brock confirmed. Agent Morrison will be here at 2 p.m. with the federal task force. The timing is perfect. Sunday afternoon, quiet neighborhood, minimal witnesses until we want them. And the commitment papers? Dr. Carrington is standing by. Once Gideon's arrested and the evidence of his mental breakdown is established, we'll have 72 hours to get him transferred to the facility in Switzerland. Gideon's jaw tightened. Even knowing what was coming, hearing them discuss his kidnapping so casually was enraging. What about the children? Celeste asked. Ivy's on her honeymoon, completely unreachable for the next 2 weeks. By the time she finds out what happened, it'll be too late for her to interfere. And Finn, Brock shrugged. He's 17. His testimony won't matter against federal evidence and medical expert opinion. They had no idea that Finn was currently in position in his bedroom, monitoring their conversation and coordinating with contacts that would have impressed Gideon's old Pentagon colleagues. The money, Celeste's voice held a note of anxiety. Already transferred. As soon as Gideon's arrested, we implement the contingency plan. You file for emergency divorce proceedings claiming mental cruelty and fraud. I provide the business evidence, and we're on a plane to Costa Rica within 48 hours. And if he tries to fight the charges? Brock's laugh was coldly confident. Darling, the man will be in a padded room in Switzerland within a week. He won't be fighting anything. Gideon had heard enough. He activated the secure comm system Finn had established and sent a simple message, green light. The next phase of their counter-operation began immediately. In his bedroom, Finn initiated a series of digital transmissions that had been prepared weeks in advance. The first package went to FBI agent Sarah Chun, head of the Federal Task Force investigating charity fraud. The second went to IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The third went to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Each package contained the complete evidence of Brock and Celeste's criminal enterprise, along with a detailed analysis of their ongoing conspiracy to frame Gideon. But more importantly, each package included real-time surveillance footage of the conversation that had just taken place in the Hale foyer. The timing was critical. The federal agencies would receive evidence of the conspiracy just minutes before the corrupted task force arrived to arrest Gideon. When Agent Morrison and his team arrived with their fabricated warrants, they would walk into a situation that had already been reported to federal oversight. Gideon, Celeste's voice called from downstairs. Could you join us in the living room? Brock has some concerns about the Patterson project that require your input. It was time for the performance of his life. Gideon descended the stairs to find Brock standing near the fireplace, his briefcase open on the coffee table. Several documents were spread across the surface, the fabricated evidence that was meant to support the criminal charges. Brock, Gideon said pleasantly, I hope you're not working too hard on a Sunday. Just trying to clean up some discrepancies in the project files. Brock replied with practiced ease. There seemed to be some irregularities in the financial reporting that I wanted to discuss with you before they became a larger issue. The irony was perfect. The man who had been systematically embezzling from children's charities was accusing Gideon of financial irregularities. What kind of discrepancies? Gideon asked, settling into his usual chair. Brock launched into a detailed explanation of the fabricated evidence, each accusation carefully crafted to paint Gideon as mentally unstable and criminally negligent. Client funds allegedly misappropriated, project specifications allegedly altered for personal gain, business partnerships allegedly manipulated through fraud and intimidation. It was, Gideon had to admit, a masterful frame job. If he hadn't known the truth, he might have been convinced by the documentation Brock presented. These are serious allegations, Gideon said when Brock finished his presentation. I'm afraid they are, Brock replied with false regret, which is why I felt obligated to report them to the appropriate authorities. You reported me to federal investigators? I had no choice, Gideon. As your business partner, I could have been held criminally liable if I'd failed to report suspected fraud. Celeste moved to stand behind Gideon's chair, placing her hands on his shoulders in a gesture that appeared supportive but felt like the closing of a trap. We're here for you, darling, she said softly. Whatever happens, we'll get through this together. I've already spoken to Dr. Carrington about helping you work through this crisis. The setup was perfect. When the federal agents arrived, they would find Gideon confronted with evidence of his crimes, supported by his concerned wife and business partner, clearly in need of psychological intervention. What they didn't know was that every word of their conversation was being transmitted in real time to the actual FBI task force investigating charity fraud. Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from Finn, cavalry inbound. ETA 10 minutes. You know, Gideon said conversationally, I've always admired your strategic thinking, Brock. This is really quite an elegant operation. Something in his tone made Brock's eyes narrow slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. The long-term planning, the attention to detail, the way you've coordinated multiple moving pieces into a single, devastating attack. Gideon smiled pleasantly. If I didn't know better, I'd say you learned psychological warfare from a professional. Gideon, Celeste said carefully, you're starting to sound a bit paranoid. Am I? Or am I just finally seeing the situation clearly? He stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the front drive. Tell me, Brock, when did you first decide that framing me for charity fraud would be more profitable than simply stealing my business? The color drained from Brock's face. I have no idea what you're talking about. The Whitmore Foundation, St. Mary's Children's Cancer Ward, the Domestic Violence Shelter, the Scholarship Program. Gideon turned back to face them, his expression cold and predatory. Did you really think I wouldn't eventually notice that my wife's family charity was being systematically looted? Celeste's mask finally slipped, her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal something desperate and dangerous underneath. You can't prove anything, she said quietly. Can I? Gideon pulled out his phone and showed them the surveillance application. Every word you've spoken in this house for the past 3 months has been recorded. Every transaction, every communication, every planning session for your little Costa Rica retirement plan. Brock lunged for his briefcase, probably reaching for a weapon, but froze when he heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway. Through the window, Gideon could see a convoy of black SUVs surrounding the house. Not the small task force that Brock had arranged, but a full federal response team. That would be the real FBI, Gideon said pleasantly. I believe they have some questions about missing charity funds and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. As federal agents surrounded the house, Gideon's phone buzzed with a final message from Finn. Welcome to the trap, Mom. Hope you enjoy your stay. Chapter 5, The Unraveling. The next 30 minutes unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Agent Sarah Chun, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, entered the living room flanked by 6 federal agents while additional teams secured the perimeter and began executing search warrants throughout the house. Mr. Valdez, Mrs. Hale, Agent Chun announced, you are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud against federal tax-exempt organizations, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Brock's face went ashen as Agent Chun continued reading their rights. Celeste, however, immediately shifted into survival mode, her socialite training kicking in to provide a believable performance of confused innocence. Agent Chun, there must be some mistake, Celeste said with perfect bewilderment. We were just discussing some business concerns with my husband. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Ma'am, we have documented evidence of your participation in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme targeting charitable organizations, Agent Chun replied calmly. We also have audio and video surveillance of you and Mr. Valdez discussing plans to have your husband falsely arrested and committed to a foreign psychiatric facility. That stopped Celeste cold. Her eyes darted to Gideon, who maintained an expression of careful neutrality even as satisfaction coursed through his veins. The surveillance in this house, Agent Chun continued, has been gathering evidence for federal investigators for the past 6 weeks. Every conversation, every planning session, every detail of your conspiracy has been documented. Brock found his voice at last. This is entrapment. Gideon set us up. Actually, Mr. Valdez, Agent Chun replied with a slight smile. Mr. Hale has been cooperating with our investigation since we received credible evidence of charity fraud in February. The surveillance operation was conducted under proper federal warrants as part of an ongoing criminal investigation. It was a beautiful lie, perfectly crafted to explain how the evidence had been gathered legally while protecting Finn's more questionable methods. The truth was that Finn had made contact with Agent Chin only 3 hours ago, but the fabricated timeline would hold up in court. "Where's the boy?" Brock demanded suddenly, his composure finally cracking completely. "Where's Finn? He's the one who's been spying on us, isn't he?" As if summoned by his name, Finn appeared in the doorway of the living room. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man in his 50s wearing a Navy uniform with the insignia of a rear admiral. "Admiral Crawford," Gideon said, snapping unconsciously to attention. "I wasn't expecting you, sir." "At ease, Colonel," Admiral Crawford replied, using Gideon's old military rank. "Your son contacted the Office of Naval Intelligence yesterday with some rather disturbing intelligence about a conspiracy involving military contractors and federal crimes." Finn's coup de grace was revealed. He hadn't just gathered evidence of charity fraud. He discovered that Brock's architectural firm had been working on classified military construction projects, and the same shell companies used to launder charity money had also been used to inflate costs on federal defense contracts. "Mr. Valdez," Admiral Crawford continued, "your firm has been billing the Department of Defense for materials and services that were never provided. The financial forensics team estimates the total fraud at approximately $12 million over 3 years." Brock's legs gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair. Military contractor fraud carried penalties that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in federal prison. "Agent Chun," Admiral Crawford said formally, "I'm invoking joint federal jurisdiction on this matter. This is now a combined civilian-military criminal investigation." As federal agents began collecting evidence throughout the house, Celeste made one last desperate play. She turned to Gideon with tears streaming down her face. Whether genuine or performed, he couldn't tell. "Gideon, please," she whispered. "We've been married for 25 years. We have children together. Surely there's some way we can work this out privately." For a moment, looking at his wife's tear-stained face, Gideon felt an echo of the man he'd been 6 months ago, the man who might have been willing to forgive, to find a way forward that preserved their family. Then he remembered the children's cancer ward, the domestic violence shelter, the scholarship fund, the families whose lives had been damaged by Celeste and Brock's greed. "No," he said quietly, "there isn't." Agent Chin's team worked with methodical efficiency, collecting computers, financial records, and communication devices. The evidence was overwhelming, years of financial crimes documented in meticulous detail, thanks to Finn's digital archaeology and the real-time surveillance of their final planning session. "Mr. Hale," Agent Chin said as her team prepared to transport the prisoners, "we'll need you and your son to come to the federal building tomorrow morning for complete debriefing. The scope of this conspiracy appears to be larger than we initially suspected." "Of course," Gideon replied. "We're fully committed to assisting with the investigation." As the federal convoy departed with Celeste and Brock in custody, Gideon and Finn stood in the suddenly quiet foyer of their home. The silence felt strange after months of careful planning and the morning's dramatic conclusion. "How did you make contact with Admiral Crawford?" Gideon asked. Finn's grin was pure pride. "Remember General Morrison from your old unit? He's Admiral Crawford's chief of staff now. When I explained what we'd uncovered about the defense contractor fraud, he arranged the meeting. And you figured out the military connection how. Brock's been billing the Pentagon for premium materials while actually using substandard supplies," Finn explained. "The cost difference went into the same accounts as the charity money. It was just another revenue stream for their Costa Rica fund." Gideon shook his head in amazement. His 17-year-old son had unraveled a criminal conspiracy that involved multiple federal agencies and millions of dollars in stolen funds. "There's something else," Finn said, his expression growing serious. "Something I didn't tell you before." "What?" "The psychiatric facility in Switzerland. The one where they were planning to have you committed." Finn paused. "Dr. Carrington isn't just affiliated with it. He owns it, and it's not a legitimate medical facility." The final piece of their plan became clear. They weren't just planning to have him declared mentally incompetent. They were planning to have him disappeared into a private facility where he could be held indefinitely without oversight or legal recourse. How many others? Gideon asked quietly. At least a dozen over the past 5 years, Finn replied. All wealthy men whose wives wanted to access their assets without the complications of divorce proceedings. The facility doesn't exist in any official medical database. As far as the world would know, you simply vanished. The scope of their criminality was staggering. This wasn't just theft or fraud. It was human trafficking on an international scale. The Admiral's team is coordinating with Interpol, Finn continued. Dr. Carrington and his operation will be shut down within 48 hours. Gideon felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. Celeste and Brock hadn't just betrayed him. They'd walked into a trap that would expose a criminal enterprise spanning multiple countries and countless victims. What happens now? Finn asked. Gideon considered the question carefully. With Celeste and Brock in federal custody facing decades in prison, their immediate threat was neutralized. But there would be trials, media attention, and the complex process of unwinding their criminal enterprise. Now we make sure they never hurt anyone again, Gideon replied. And we rebuild our family without the people who tried to destroy it. What about Ivy? That was the one variable that still concerned Gideon. His daughter was on her honeymoon, completely unaware that her mother and godfather had been arrested for federal crimes. The news would devastate her. We tell her the truth, Gideon said finally. All of it. She deserves to know what kind of people she was trusting with her life. Finn nodded solemnly. At 17, he'd learned lessons about betrayal and family loyalty that most people never faced. But he'd also learned that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to be willing to destroy the people who threaten them. Dad, Finn said as they headed upstairs to begin the process of contacting lawyers and preparing for the media storm that would inevitably follow. Yeah, I'm glad you never taught me to forgive people who try to hurt our family. Gideon smiled grimly. Some lessons are more important than others, son. Remember that. As they reached the top of the stairs, Gideon's phone buzzed with a text from Admiral Crawford. Carrington facility raided. 12 victims recovered alive. Your intelligence saved lives, Colonel. The trap they'd set had been even more successful than they planned. Celeste and Brock weren't just facing prison. They'd helped expose a criminal network that had been operating internationally for years. It was, Gideon reflected, exactly the kind of comprehensive victory that his enemies deserved. Chapter 6, Scorched Earth. 3 days after the arrests, the media storm had exceeded even Gideon's expectations. The story had everything journalists loved: wealth, betrayal, international conspiracy, and charitable funds stolen from dying children. By Wednesday morning, Celeste and Brock's photos were on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. Gideon sat in his study reviewing the morning's coverage when his lawyer, David Manning, arrived with an update on the legal proceedings. The federal prosecutor is calling it one of the most comprehensive charity fraud cases in history, Manning reported, settling into the chair across from Gideon's desk. Between the domestic embezzlement and the international human trafficking conspiracy, they're looking at charges that could result in multiple life sentences. Good, Gideon replied without emotion. What about the civil implications? That's where things get interesting, Manning continued. The Foundation Board is filing civil suits to recover the stolen funds. But there's also discussion of victim compensation. The families affected by the medical funding shortfalls, the scholarship recipients who lost opportunities, the domestic violence shelter that had to cut services, they're all potential claimants. Gideon had been expecting this. The financial damages from Celeste and Brock's crimes extended far beyond the money they'd stolen. Real people had suffered real consequences because of their greed. What's the potential exposure? Conservative estimate? 40 to 50 million in damages and penalties, Manning replied. Celeste's family foundation is effectively bankrupt, and Brock's assets have been frozen pending the criminal trial. The phone rang, interrupting their discussion. Gideon's caller ID showed it was Ivy, finally returning from her honeymoon. Dad, his daughter's voice was shaky, clearly struggling with the news reports she'd undoubtedly seen. I just got back and saw. I can't believe. Is it true? Come home, sweetheart, Gideon said gently. We need to talk. An hour later, Ivy sat in the same living room where her mother and Brock had been arrested, listening in stunned silence as Gideon and Finn explained the full scope of the conspiracy. Her new husband, Riley, sat beside her, holding her hand as she processed the betrayal of the two people she trusted most outside her immediate family. The Costa Rica house, Ivy said finally. Mom always said it was her dream retirement destination. She made it sound so romantic. She was planning to live there on money stolen from cancer patients, Finn said bluntly, while Dad rotted in a Swiss psychiatric facility. Ivy flinched at his harsh tone, but Gideon noticed she didn't argue with the assessment. His daughter was naive about many things, but she wasn't stupid. What happens to us now? She asked quietly. That depends on what you mean by U.S., Gideon replied carefully. Your mother made choices that have consequences. Those consequences don't have to define your life, but they are real. Will I have to testify? Probably, Manning interjected. The prosecution will want to establish the family dynamics and the extent to which Celeste deceived everyone around her. Ivy's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to run to Gideon for comfort after nightmares. But she was a married woman now, with her own life and her own choices to make. I can't visit her in prison, Ivy said through tears. I know that makes me a terrible daughter, but I can't look at her knowing what she did to you and to all those families. That doesn't make you terrible, Gideon said firmly. That makes you someone with a moral compass. Riley spoke for the first time since hearing the full story. What kind of support does your family need right now? Practically speaking, Gideon appreciated his son-in-law's pragmatic approach. The media attention will die down eventually, but this case will probably take years to fully resolve. Ivy's going to be identified as the daughter of the defendants, which could affect her professionally and socially. We'll deal with it, Riley said simply. Ivy's not responsible for her mother's crimes. That afternoon brought another unexpected visitor. Emma Richardson, executive director of the Whitmore Foundation, arrived looking haggard and desperate. Mr. Hale, she began without preamble, I've been trying to reach you for days. The foundation board needs to discuss the succession plan. Gideon frowned. Succession plan? Celeste was the foundation's primary trustee, Richardson explained. With her arrest and the criminal charges, the board needs to appoint a replacement immediately. As her husband and the father of her children, you're the legal heir to her position. The irony was perfect. The foundation that Celeste had looted was now offering him control of its operations. What's the current financial status? Gideon asked. Catastrophic, Richardson admitted. Between the stolen funds and the legal costs, we're looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. The only way to continue operating is if someone with significant resources takes over and commits to restoring the foundation's credibility. Finn looked up from his laptop where he'd been monitoring the ongoing media coverage. Dad, the foundation still has the infrastructure to do real good. All the programs Mom and Brock corrupted, we could actually make them work the way they were supposed to. Gideon considered the proposal. Taking over the foundation would mean committing significant personal resources to repair the damage Celeste had caused. But it would also mean turning her weapon against charity into an actual force for good. I'll need complete control, Gideon said finally. New board, new policies, independent oversight. Whatever you need, Richardson replied eagerly. The alternative is complete dissolution and criminal liability for the board members who failed to detect the fraud. And I want Finn involved in the oversight structure, Gideon continued. He's the one who uncovered the corruption. He should have a voice in preventing it from happening again. That evening, as Gideon and Finn worked through the legal requirements for foundation restructuring, Admiral Crawford called with another update on the international investigation. The Swiss facility raid yielded intelligence on similar operations in 6 other countries, the Admiral reported. Carrington was just one node in a network that's been trafficking wealthy individuals for over a decade. Your wife and Valdez weren't just criminals. They were connected to organized crime on a global scale. The scope of Celeste's betrayal continued to expand. She hadn't just stolen from him and cheated on their marriage. She'd allied herself with international criminals who specialized in making inconvenient people disappear. Any word on their cooperation with the investigation? Gideon asked. Valdez is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but he doesn't have much to offer that we don't already know. Your wife, on the other hand. The Admiral paused. She's maintaining complete silence. Her lawyers are advising a full defense strategy. Gideon wasn't surprised. Celeste had always been stubborn, and she'd probably convinced herself that her social connections and family influence could somehow protect her from the consequences of her actions. How long until trial? Federal cases of this complexity usually take 18 to 24 months to reach court, the Admiral replied. But given the international elements and the number of victims, it could be longer. After the call ended, Gideon found himself alone in his study for the first time since the arrests. The house felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if removing Celeste's presence had eliminated a source of contamination he hadn't fully recognized while it was there. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You destroyed my life, and I'll destroy yours. Watch your back. The message was clearly from someone associated with Celeste or Brock, probably a contact from their criminal network who hadn't been caught in the federal sweep. Gideon forwarded the message to Admiral Crawford and made a note to increase security around the house. Finn appeared in the doorway, as if sensing his father's concern. Everything okay? Just someone who doesn't understand that their war is already over, Gideon replied, showing him the threatening message. Finn's expression hardened. Should we be worried? We should be prepared, Gideon corrected. There's a difference. As father and son began reviewing their security protocols, Gideon reflected on how completely their roles had evolved. Finn was no longer just his son. He was his strategic partner in protecting their family and ensuring that justice was served. Dad, Finn said as they finished their security review, I need to ask you something. What is it? Are you okay with being the kind of man who destroys people who betray him? Gideon considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he might have struggled with the moral implications of his actions. Now, having seen the full scope of Celeste and Brock's crimes, he felt no such uncertainty. Son, there are people in this world who prey on others, who steal from dying children and plan to make innocent men disappear. Those people don't deserve mercy or forgiveness. They deserve to be stopped permanently. Finn nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. Besides, Gideon added with a cold smile, I didn't destroy them. I just gave them enough rope to hang themselves. As they prepared for bed, both men understood that their war was far from over. The criminal trials would take years, the civil litigation even longer. There would be appeals, countersuits, and probably more threats from the remnants of the criminal network. But Celeste and Brock had made one fatal miscalculation. They'd assumed that Gideon's love for his family made him vulnerable, when in fact it made him absolutely ruthless. They were about to spend the rest of their lives learning the difference. Chapter 7. The Trial of Betrayal. 18 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan had become the epicenter of what media outlets were calling the trial of the decade. The prosecution's case against Celeste Hale and Brock Valdez had grown even stronger as international investigators uncovered additional victims and evidence of their conspiracy. Gideon sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, watching his wife of 25 years face charges that could result in multiple life sentences. Celeste had aged dramatically during her time in federal custody. Her once pristine appearance now replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. The prosecution calls Finn Hale to the stand, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Vance, a veteran prosecutor who had built her career on complex financial crimes. At 19, Finn had grown into a formidable young man whose testimony had been crucial in building the federal case. He walked to the witness stand with the same calm confidence he displayed during the initial investigation, showing no nervousness despite the media attention focused on every word. Mr. Hale, Vance began, please tell the court how you first became aware of your mother's criminal activities. Finn's voice was steady as he recounted discovering the discrepancies in the Foundation's financial records, his methodical investigation of the shell companies, and the gradual realization that his mother and Brock were systematically stealing from charitable organizations. "And what did you do with this information?" "I documented everything," Finn replied. "Every transaction, every communication, every piece of evidence that showed they were stealing money meant to help cancer patients, domestic violence victims, and underprivileged students." Celeste's defense attorney, a prominent white-collar criminal lawyer named Jonathan Pierce, objected to the characterization, but Judge Catherine Morrison overruled him. The evidence of the defendant's crimes was too overwhelming for procedural challenges. "Mr. Hale," Vance continued, "did there come a time when you learned about your mother's plan to have your father falsely arrested and committed to a psychiatric facility in Switzerland?" "Yes. 3 days before my sister's wedding, I intercepted communications between my mother and Dr. Carrington detailing the plan to have my father declared mentally incompetent and transferred to a facility where he could be held indefinitely." The prosecution presented the recorded conversations from the wedding day, playing them for the jury with crystal clarity. Celeste's voice filled the courtroom as she discussed the timing of Gideon's arrest, the fabricated evidence, and the logistics of having him transported to Switzerland. During cross-examination, Pierce attempted to portray Finn as a disturbed teenager who had violated his mother's privacy and possibly fabricated evidence. But Finn's calm, detailed responses and the corroborating physical evidence made Pierce's attacks seem desperate rather than effective. "Mr. Hale," Pierce said during his cross-examination, "isn't it true that you harbor resentment toward your mother because of her relationship with Mr. Valdez?" "No," Finn replied simply. "I harbor resentment toward my mother because she stole money from dying children to fund her retirement with a man who was planning to have my father kidnapped." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Morrison gavelled for order. "Your Honor," Pierce protested, "the witness is editorializing." "The witness is answering your question, Counselor," Judge Morrison replied dryly. "Proceed." The prosecution's case continued for 3 weeks, with testimony from foundation executives, hospital administrators, scholarship recipients who had lost funding, and FBI agents who had investigated the international trafficking network. Each witness added another layer to the evidence, showing that Celeste and Brock's crimes had affected hundreds of innocent people. Admiral Crawford testified about the military contractor fraud, explaining how Brock had inflated defense contracts while delivering substandard materials to military facilities. The financial forensics expert detailed the complex money laundering scheme that had moved millions of dollars through shell companies to the Costa Rica accounts. But the most devastating testimony came from Dr. Hans Mueller, a former patient at the Swiss facility who had been rescued during the international raid. "I was held there for 3 years," Mueller testified via video link from Germany. "My wife had me committed after claiming I was mentally unstable, but in reality, she wanted access to my pharmaceutical company. Dr. Carrington and his staff used experimental drugs to keep patients disoriented and compliant." Mueller's testimony established that the facility wasn't just fraudulent, it was a human rights violation on an international scale. Celeste hadn't just been planning to steal Gideon's money, she'd been planning to have him tortured. When the prosecution rested, Pierce's defense strategy became clear. He couldn't challenge the evidence of his client's crimes, so he attempted to portray them as victims of Gideon's manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Pierce said in his opening statement for the defense, "my client Celeste Hale was a woman trapped in an abusive marriage to a man trained in psychological warfare. Everything she did was motivated by fear and desperation, not greed. It was a risky strategy that required Pierce to put Celeste on the stand to testify about alleged abuse that had never been reported to authorities and wasn't supported by any evidence. Celeste's testimony was a masterclass in manipulation. She spoke tearfully about feeling controlled and intimidated by Gideon's military background, claiming that she'd been afraid to leave the marriage directly because of his volatile personality. "I knew he had connections in the intelligence community," she testified. "I was terrified that if I simply filed for divorce, he would use those connections to discredit me or worse." The performance might have been compelling if not for the overwhelming evidence of her crimes and the recorded conversations showing her calculating discussion of having Gideon kidnapped. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Vance systematically dismantled Celeste's victim narrative. Mrs. Hale, you testified that you were afraid of your husband's reaction to divorce. But you weren't planning to divorce him, were you? What do you mean? You were planning to have him declared mentally incompetent and committed to a foreign psychiatric facility where he could be held indefinitely. That's not divorce, is it? I was trying to get him help. Mrs. Hale, did Dr. Carrington's facility appear in any official medical database? I don't know. Were any of the patients at Dr. Carrington's facility there voluntarily? I assume. Mrs. Hale, isn't it true that you weren't trying to escape an abusive marriage, but rather to commit a perfect crime by making your husband disappear while stealing millions of dollars from charitable organizations? Celeste's composure finally cracked. He made me do it, she screamed. Everything was his fault. He was cold and controlling, and he never loved me the way Brock did. The outburst destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for her. She just admitted that the entire scheme was motivated by her affair, not by fear or abuse. Brock's testimony was even more disastrous. He attempted to claim that he'd been manipulated by Celeste, portraying himself as a lovesick fool who had been led astray by a seductive woman. But the prosecution's evidence showed that many of the fraudulent schemes had been his ideas, and his military contractor fraud had predated his affair with Celeste by 2 years. Mr. Valdez, Vance said during cross-examination, you testified that you were influenced by Mrs. Hale's emotional manipulation. But the evidence shows that you were already defrauding the Department of Defense before you began your affair with her. Isn't that correct? Those were business decisions. Business decisions to steal from the United States military while providing substandard materials that could have endangered the lives of service members. Brock's attempt to blame Celeste for his crimes fell apart under scrutiny, and his own recorded statements about the Swiss facility plan showed him to be an enthusiastic participant rather than a reluctant accomplice. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Celeste and Brock were convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and multiple counts of theft from federal tax-exempt organizations. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the message was clear. Both defendants would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. As the verdicts were read, Gideon felt no triumph or satisfaction. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous. His children had lost their mother, his family had been destroyed, and hundreds of innocent people had suffered because of Celeste and Brock's greed. Outside the courthouse, Finn stood beside his father as reporters shouted questions about the case and its implications. How do you feel about your mother's conviction? One reporter called out. Finn's response was measured and final. My mother chose to steal from dying children to fund her affair. The jury's verdict reflects the consequences of those choices. As they walked to their car, Gideon realized that his son had learned the most important lesson of all. Loyalty to family meant protecting the innocent, not enabling the guilty. The war was finally over, and they had won. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold February morning, exactly 2 years after Gideon had first discovered Celeste's affair. Judge Morrison's courtroom was packed with victims, family members, and media representatives who had followed the case from its explosive beginning to its inevitable conclusion. Celeste sat at the defense table wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, her once immaculate appearance now a shadow of its former self. The woman who had prided herself on her social connections and family influence had been reduced to just another federal prisoner awaiting judgment. Brock appeared equally diminished, his formerly confident demeanor replaced by the hollow resignation of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Before I impose sentence, Judge Morrison announced, I will hear from the victims who wish to address the court. The first speaker was Dr. Patricia Williams, Chief of Pediatric Oncology at St. Mary's Hospital. Her voice was steady but filled with controlled anger as she addressed the defendants. Because of your theft, we were forced to reduce our patient care services by 40%, she said, looking directly at Celeste. Families who were already facing the worst crisis of their lives had to worry about whether their children would receive adequate treatment. Some of our young patients suffered delays in critical care because the funding you stole was money we had counted on to save lives. The impact statements continued for nearly 3 hours. Scholarship recipients who had lost educational opportunities. Domestic violence survivors whose shelter had been forced to turn away women in crisis. Military families whose loved ones had been housed in buildings constructed with substandard materials because of Brock's fraud. Each story added weight to the magnitude of Celeste and Brock's crimes, showing that their betrayal had extended far beyond Gideon's family. I would like to address the court. The voice came from an unexpected source, Emma Richardson, the foundation director who had approached Gideon about taking over the organization. "Your Honor," Richardson said, "I've worked for charitable organizations for 20 years, and I've never seen a case where the criminals showed such complete disregard for the people they were supposed to be helping. Mrs. Hale didn't just steal money. She perverted the very concept of charity, turning an organization dedicated to helping others into a vehicle for her own greed." When the victim statements concluded, Judge Morrison invited the defendants to make final statements before sentencing. Brock's attorney had clearly coached him to express remorse, but his words sounded hollow and rehearsed. He spoke about making poor decisions and being led astray, but never acknowledged the full scope of his crimes or the suffering they had caused. Celeste's statement was more revealing. She maintained that she had been manipulated by both Gideon and Brock, portraying herself as a victim even as she sat convicted of crimes that had harmed hundreds of people. "I never intended for anyone to be hurt," she said tearfully. "I was just trying to find happiness after years of feeling trapped and unloved." The performance might have been moving if not for the recorded evidence of her calculating discussions about having Gideon kidnapped and the systematic nature of her theft from charitable organizations. Judge Morrison's response was swift and devastating. "Mrs. Hale, you have had 2 years to reflect on your actions, yet you continue to blame others for choices that were entirely your own. You stole from cancer patients, abuse victims, and disadvantaged students not because you were trapped or manipulated, but because you valued your own comfort over their suffering." The judge turned to Brock. "Mr. Valdez, your crimes included defrauding the United States military, potentially endangering the lives of service members through the provision of substandard materials. Your betrayal of trust extended beyond personal relationships to your duties as a citizen and contractor." Judge Morrison's sentences reflected the severity of their crimes and the lack of genuine remorse from either defendant. Celeste received 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Brock received 50 years, with the additional time reflecting his military contractor fraud. At their ages, both sentences were effectively life terms. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, "I am ordering complete asset forfeiture to provide restitution to the victims of your crimes. Every property, investment, and asset connected to your criminal enterprise will be liquidated and distributed to the charitable organizations and individuals you harmed." As the court officers prepare to transport the defendants back to federal custody, Celeste made eye contact with Gideon for the first time during the entire proceedings. Her expression held a mixture of hatred and desperation that revealed the true nature of the woman he had been married to for 25 years. "This isn't over," she mouthed silently. Gideon's response was a slight smile that conveyed absolute indifference to her threats. She had no power left to harm him or his family. Her war was over, and she had lost completely. Outside the courthouse, reporters again pressed for statements from the Hale family. This time, Gideon chose to speak. "Justice was served today," he said simply. "The victims of these crimes can begin the process of healing, knowing that the people who hurt them will never have the opportunity to harm anyone else." "Do you have any final words for your wife?" a reporter asked. Gideon's expression was cold and final. "I have no wife. I have no message for the criminals who were sentenced today. They chose their path, and now they must face the consequences." Later that evening, Gideon and Finn sat in the study where they had first planned their counterattack against Celeste and Brock's conspiracy. The foundation restructuring was complete, and the organization was now funding legitimate charitable work under independent oversight. Any regrets? Finn asked. Gideon considered the question seriously. The past 2 years had been brutal. The investigation, the trial, the media scrutiny, and the destruction of his marriage. But the alternative would have been worse. If we hadn't acted, they would have succeeded, Gideon replied. I would be rotting in a Swiss psychiatric facility while they lived off money stolen from dying children. They would have continued their crimes, harming more victims. So no regrets? None whatsoever. Ivy and Riley arrived for dinner, as they did every Sunday since the trial had ended. Ivy had struggled with her mother's crimes and imprisonment, but she had ultimately chosen to maintain her relationship with her father and brother while cutting all contact with Celeste. The foundation approved funding for the new children's wing at St. Mary's. Ivy reported during dinner. $5 million for state-of-the-art cancer treatment facilities. It was fitting justice. Money that Celeste had stolen from sick children was now being used to provide them with better care than they would have received if she had never committed her crimes. Any word from the parole board? Riley asked. Neither of them is eligible for parole, Finn replied. Federal sentences, over 40 years with no possibility of early release. They'll die in prison. The conversation continued with updates on family life, business matters, and foundation activities. To an outside observer, they appear to be a normal family discussing routine concerns. But Gideon knew they had been forged by fire into something stronger than most families ever achieved. They had faced betrayal from within and emerged united and stronger. They had chosen justice over sentiment, truth over convenience, and protection of the innocent over misplaced loyalty. As the evening wound down and his children prepared to leave, Gideon reflected on the lessons learned through their ordeal. Love without boundaries was not love, it was enabling. Forgiveness without consequences was not mercy, it was injustice. Dad, Finn said as he prepared to leave for his college dorm, I need to tell you something. What is it? I'm proud to be your son, not because of what we did to them, but because you taught me that protecting innocent people is more important than protecting guilty ones, even when the guilty ones are family. Gideon nodded, understanding that his son had learned the most important lesson a man could learn. That true strength came not from the ability to forgive, but from the wisdom to know when forgiveness would enable further harm. As his family departed and the house settled into quiet, Gideon allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Celeste and Brock would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. The victims they had harmed were receiving restitution and justice. The criminal network they had been part of was dismantled. His phone buzzed with a message from Admiral Crawford. Carrington sentenced to life without parole. Swiss facility victims receiving compensation. Your intelligence saved lives, Colonel. The final piece of justice had been served. The man who would have tortured Gideon in a fake psychiatric facility was now facing his own lifetime imprisonment. Gideon poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled into his chair, finally allowing himself to feel the peace that came with complete victory. He had protected his family, served justice, and ensured that two dangerous criminals would never hurt anyone again. In the end, that was all that mattered. Chapter 9. Legacy of Steel. 5 years after the sentencing, Gideon stood in the boardroom of the restructured Whitmore Foundation, looking out over the city skyline as he prepared for the annual board meeting. The organization had not only recovered from Celeste's crimes, but had grown into one of the most respected charitable institutions in the country. Finn, now 24 and holding a master's degree in forensic accounting, served as the foundation's director of financial oversight, a position created specifically to ensure that no one could ever again manipulate the organization for personal gain. The numbers are impressive, Finn reported to the board. Last year, we distributed $43 million in grants, with overhead costs under 8%. Independent audits confirm that every dollar is being used for its intended purpose. Ivy, now a successful architect in her own right, had joined the board 2 years earlier. She specialized in designing facilities for the organizations the foundation supported, hospitals, shelters, and schools that served vulnerable populations. The new children's hospital in Newark will break ground next month, she announced. The design incorporates every advanced feature available for pediatric cancer treatment, funded entirely by foundation grants. Gideon felt a deep satisfaction as he watched his children carry forward the mission that had emerged from their family's destruction. They had taken the weapon that Celeste had used against Charity and transformed it into a force that would help thousands of people. After the meeting, the three of them walked to lunch at a restaurant near the Foundation's offices. It had become their tradition, a monthly family meal where they discussed both business and personal matters. Any word from the appeals court? Ivy asked as they settled into their table. Final denial last week, Finn replied. Celeste's lawyers exhausted their last option. The conviction and sentence are permanent. Celeste had spent 5 years filing appeals, claiming everything from ineffective counsel to judicial bias. Every appeal had been denied, and she would remain in federal prison until her death. What about Brock? He stopped filing appeals 2 years ago, Gideon said. His health is deteriorating rapidly. The prison doctors don't expect him to live much longer. It was perhaps the final justice. Brock would die in a federal prison medical ward, a fitting end for a man who had planned to profit from others' suffering. Have you thought about what you'll do when the Foundation is fully established? Riley asked Gideon. Their family dinners had expanded to include spouses as the next generation built their own lives. I've had an offer from the State Department, Gideon replied. They want me to head up a new task force investigating international financial crimes, specifically targeting organizations like the Swiss Facility Network. Finn's eyes lit up with interest. That sounds like exactly the kind of work you were meant to do. It would mean travel, probably dangerous assignments, Gideon cautioned, and dealing with criminals who make Celeste and Brock look like amateurs. Dad, Ivy said firmly, you spent 30 years preparing for that kind of work, and the last 5 years proving that you can take down criminal conspiracies that others can't even detect. If anyone can protect innocent people from international predators, it's you. Gideon smiled at his daughter's confidence. She had inherited her mother's determination, but channeled it toward protecting others rather than exploiting them. There's something else, Finn added. The Foundation Board has been discussing establishing an international division. If you take the State Department position, we could coordinate our efforts, legitimate charitable work supported by intelligence operations, against the people who prey on charitable organizations. The idea had merit. Gideon's government work could identify criminal networks, while the Foundation's legitimate operations could provide cover for intelligence gathering and support for victims. We'd be turning Dad into a professional enemy of bad people, Ivy observed with a grin. I've always been an enemy of bad people, Gideon replied. The only difference would be getting paid by the government to do what I do anyway. Their lunch was interrupted by Gideon's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Admiral Crawford, now heading the Pentagon's Financial Crimes Division. Colonel, the Admiral said without preamble, we have a situation that requires your expertise. Can you be in Washington tomorrow morning? What kind of situation? The kind that involves missing children, international trafficking, and criminals who think they're untouchable because of their wealth and connections. Gideon's expression hardened. I'll be there. After ending the call, he looked at his children with the same expression they had seen 5 years earlier when they first uncovered Celeste's conspiracy. Duty calls? Finn asked. Something like that, Gideon replied. It seems there are more people in this world who need to learn that money and connections don't make you immune to consequences. Need any help with research or financial analysis? Finn offered. Always. But this time we do it officially, with proper government authorization and legal oversight. Much less fun than our amateur detective work, Finn observed with mock disappointment. But much more effective in the long run, Gideon replied. As they finished their meal and prepared to return to their respective responsibilities, Gideon reflected on how completely their family had been transformed by the crucible of betrayal and justice. Finn had evolved from a teenager uncovering his mother's affair to a professional financial investigator dedicated to protecting charitable organizations from fraud. Ivy had grown from a naive young woman to a successful architect who used her skills to build facilities that served vulnerable populations. Both of his children had learned to channel their intelligence and determination toward protecting innocent people rather than pursuing personal advantage. They had become exactly the kind of people the world needed more of, individuals with the skills and moral clarity to stand against those who exploited others. That evening, as Gideon prepared for his trip to Washington, he received an unexpected piece of mail. It was a letter from Celeste, the first communication he had received from her since her conviction. The letter was brief and predictable. She blamed him for destroying her life, claimed that she had been driven to crime by his emotional coldness, and suggested that a real man would have found a way to forgive her mistakes and rebuild their marriage. Gideon read the letter once, then fed it into his paper shredder without a second thought. Celeste still didn't understand that her crimes weren't mistakes. They were choices that revealed her fundamental character. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, convinced that she was a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She would never accept responsibility for the suffering she had caused or acknowledge the justice of her punishment. That was fine with Gideon. His concern was not with reforming criminals, but with protecting their potential victims. The next morning, as he boarded a flight to Washington, Gideon carried with him the knowledge that his family had not only survived betrayal, but had emerged stronger and more purposeful than before. Finn was building a career dedicated to financial justice. Ivy was using her talents to create healing spaces for people in crisis. And Gideon himself was about to begin a new phase of his life's work, hunting down international criminals who believed their wealth and connections made them untouchable. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of legacy he wanted to leave his children. The knowledge that some people in the world would always stand against those who preyed on the innocent, regardless of the cost or complexity of the fight. As his plane lifted off, Gideon smiled with the cold satisfaction of a predator